No hyperspace trail. No transponder codes. No warning from the Republic's furthest listening posts. One moment, Coruscant's orbital defense grid was tracking the ordinary churn of Clone Wars. Traffic, supply convoys, Senate shuttles. The lazy drift of Venator-class cruisers on patrol. The next moment, space itself seemed to fold, and 111 starships simply were, hanging in high orbit, like a fleet that had always been there and the galaxy had simply failed to notice until now. They were not Republic ships. They were not separatist ships. Their hulls bore no insignia any Jedi, any senator, any Coruscanti dockworker had ever seen, saucer and drive nacelle silhouettes, running lights in unfamiliar white-blue, hulls scarred in places by damage that had never been repaired, only stopped, frozen mid-wound, as though someone had reached into the last second of their deaths and simply lifted them out of it. In the Jedi Temple's High Council chamber, the alarm came not as klaxons, but as a temple guard's breathless report, and then, almost immediately after, as something far stranger, the sensation, shared by every Force-sensitive being on the planet, of the air itself being rewritten. Mace Windu felt it first as a wrongness behind his sternum, the way one feels a held breath before a saber strike. Yoda felt it differently, older, closer to a memory than a warning. Both were already moving toward the chamber before the guard finished speaking. The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web of cause and consequence, of energy meeting energy, of the 10,000 generations of Jedi who had learned to read its currents like sailors reading a sea. But the web has edges, and something had just stepped over one of them. He did not arrive with a flash of light or the tearing shriek of a hyperspace window. He simply was, mid-stride, already talking, as though he'd been in the middle of a sentence, in some other room a moment before in the council chamber was merely where the sentence happened to continue. He wore a Starfleet uniform that shimmered faintly at the edges, as though it hadn't quite decided to be fabric yet, and he looked at the assembled masters, Yoda in his hover chair, Mace Windu rising with a hand already drifting toward his belt, Kit Fisto and Plo Koon and a dozen others frozen mid-motion, with the expression of a man mildly disappointed that the room wasn't more interesting. "Oh, don't," Hugh said, waving two fingers at Windu's lightsaber hand. "I've been shot at by things with considerably more imagination than plasma swords. It won't do anything except make me feel like I've wasted a trip." "Who?" Mace Windu said, each word deliberate. "Are you?" "Hugh." He said it the way one might announce a title, a species, a punishment, and a punchline all at once. "Just Q, don't strain yourselves trying to fit me into your little taxonomy of Force sensitives and hyperspace drifters. I am, for all functional purposes in this conversation, closer to a god than anything you've prayed to. I don't require worship. I require you to listen, which I've found is a much rarer commodity." Yoda's ears had lowered, his grip tightening faintly on his Jimmer stick. Not fear, exactly, but the specific stillness of a being, recalibrating 800 years of certainty in real time. "Sense you, I do not," he said quietly. "In the Force, no shadow do you cast. No light, either. Nothing." "Correct," Hugh said, with the satisfaction of a teacher whose slowest student had finally shown up to class. "Because I'm not of your Force. I exist rather comfortably outside the entire premise of it, which I realize is upsetting, given how central it is to your worldview. Get used to it. There's quite a lot upsetting about to happen to your worldview." He gestured, not dramatically, almost lazily, toward the transparent steel windows of the chamber, toward the orbital space above, Coruscant where 111 ships now sat waiting. "That's a gift," Hugh said. 111 starships. Fully intact. Warp-capable, though you won't need that particular feature here. Your galaxy runs on a rather more provincial faster-than-light scheme. No offense. Weapons systems armed and functional. Replicators stocked. Transporters online. I pulled them out of the worst 2 minutes of their existence, which I'd argue is the single kindest thing anyone's done for them in longer than you believe. Pulled them from where? Windu demanded. A war you'll never fight. In a future that no longer belongs to them. Against an enemy that would have devoured this entire galaxy without so much as noticing it had eaten something. Interesting. Hugh's tone did not change, but something underneath it did, a flicker of something almost like old grief. Gone as quickly as it appeared. Their crews didn't survive. I couldn't save everyone. I could save the ships. And the crews now aboard them. Yoda asked, and there was something careful in the question. The sound of a being who already suspected the answer would not be simple. Hugh smiled, and it was not a comforting smile. Clones, he said. Yours, actually. Well, not yours. Not yet made. I borrowed the template. 100,000 of them. Decanted, fully grown, fully trained, fully aware, and with one very important difference. From every clone currently marching under your Republic banners. He let the pause sit, savoring it the way a man savors the last bite of something he'd been rationing. No inhibitor chips. The words meant nothing to most of the room. They meant everything to the two beings who would spend the rest of this conversation understanding exactly why Q had chosen that phrase and exactly what it had cost him nothing at all to say, and them, potentially, everything to hear. I'd sit down if I were you, Q added, almost gently, looking at Yoda. This is going to take a while, and some of it, old friend, you are not going to like. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Mace Windu did not sit down. Yoda did not sit down either, though his hoverchair dipped a fraction lower, as though he were bracing rather than resting. The other masters remained standing, a loose ring of robes and crossed arms and carefully neutral faces that were, to a being who could taste the Force the way Yoda could, anything but neutral. Fear moved through the chamber like a draft under a door, not fear of Q's power, though that was considerable and plainly, casually displayed. Fear of the shape of what he'd already said. 100,000 clones. No inhibitor chips. Said as though the chips were the anomaly and their absence the correction. Explain, Mace Windu said. Everything. From the beginning. And do not waste our time with riddles. Riddles are for beings who enjoy watching others suffer for entertainment. Hugh said, settling, uninvited, into the air itself. Cross-legged, 3 feet off the floor. As though gravity were a suggestion he found mildly beneath him. I'm considerably more direct than that. Occasionally cruel, I'll admit, but never coy. You'll find I have very little patience for coyness, which is somewhat ironic given how much of it I'm about to unpack from your own Chancellor. Palpatine, Yoda said. Not a question. A test. Sheev Palpatine, Q confirmed. And for the first time something like genuine distaste crossed his face, quickly folded away. Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic. Kind eyes, a grandfather's voice. And underneath that skin, a 2,000-year-old Sith tradition wearing a very good disguise. Darth Sidious, Dark Lord of the Sith, architect of this war you're currently losing sleep over. Though you don't yet understand that losing isn't quite the word. You're not losing the war. You're being harvested by it. The Sith Order was destroyed 1,000 years ago, said Plo Koon. Quiet but firm. The rule of two was theory, half legend. The rule of two, Hugh interrupted, is alive and extremely well and has been quietly assassinating your certainty for longer than most of you have been alive. Master Sidious. Apprentice, formerly, one Count Dooku, your former colleague. Master Yoda, your fallen Padawan's Padawan. A man who left this order believing, not entirely wrongly, that it had grown too rigid to save itself. He was right about the rot. He was catastrophically wrong about the cure. Windu's jaw tightened. Dooku serves the Separatists. Dooku serves Sidious, Hugh corrected. The Separatists serve Dooku, who serves Sidious. The Trade Federation serves whichever faction currently profits their shipping lanes, which is to say, they too serve Sidious. Though Newt Gunray is far too greedy and far too stupid to realize he's a puppet rather than a partner. The entire Separatist crisis, the blockade of Naboo a decade ago, the vote for war, the droid armies rolling off, Geonosian foundries by the million, every single beat of it was scripted by the same man sitting in the Chancellor's office granting himself emergency powers you keep voting to extend. You're saying, Windu said slowly, that Palpatine created both sides of this war. I'm saying Palpatine is both sides of this war, Q said, and now there was no theater in his voice at all, only flat, exhausted precision, the tone of a being reciting a tragedy he had watched too many times to find shocking anymore. He needed a crisis large enough to justify an army. He needed an army loyal enough that no Senate vote, no Jedi Council, no inconvenient constitutional objection could ever stand against it once he was ready to use it. So he arranged for both. The droid army to threaten the Republic, the clone army to save it. Grown on Kamino, from a template selected, he glanced at the assembled masters, gauging how much they already suspected, by a bounty hunter named Jango Fett, on the recommendation of a Jedi Master who is, at this very moment, quite dead, and whose death none of you have properly investigated. Though I'd encourage you to start. Sifo-Dyas, murmured Kit Fisto, and several masters exchanged glances that suggested this particular thread had already been tugged and abandoned, filed as a mystery rather than a warning. Sifo-Dyas ordered the clone army a decade before this war began, Hugh confirmed. Sifo-Dyas is dead. Dooku killed him, which means the order for your entire military came from a corpse, relayed through a Sith Lord's proxy, and not one of you thought that was worth losing sleep over, because the army arrived precisely when you needed it, and desperation makes for very poor detectives. The silence that followed had weight to it. Yoda's eyes had closed. And the chips, Windu said. You said no inhibitor chips. Hugh's expression shifted again, less performance now, something closer to the grief he'd let slip earlier. Every clone grown on Kamino carries a biochip, implanted during gestation, ostensibly to regulate aggression, ensure obedience, keep 100,000 genetically identical soldiers from developing anything so inconvenient as independent judgment at scale. That's the official justification, and it's a lie built on top of a lie. The chip's true function is a contingency, a trigger. Order 66. What does it do? Yoda said, and his voice, for the first time and longer than most of the masters present had ever heard, was not steady. When Sidious gives the order, Hugh said, every clone in the Grand Army of the Republic, every one of them, on every world, in every unit, standing beside every Jedi general who trusts them, who's bled beside them, who calls them brothers, turns and opens fire. On the Jedi, all of them, simultaneously, no warning, no hesitation. The chip doesn't ask them to choose. It removes the choosing entirely. Nobody spoke. Somewhere below the temple, the ordinary hum of Coruscant continued, oblivious. That's what's orbiting your planet right now instead, Hugh said quietly, gesturing again toward the window, toward the 111 ships and the 100,000 clones aboard, them who had never been given a switch to remove their will. Soldiers who get to keep the thing your Republic engineered out of every other version of them. I'd call that a mercy. You're welcome to call it whatever helps you sleep tonight. Because I promise you, after the next hour, sleep is going to be difficult regardless. The Council did not remain in the temple to argue theory while the fleet sat unexamined in orbit. Within the hour, 3 Jedi boarding parties, Obi-Wan Kenobi among them, summoned from a staging briefing on the war's eastern front the moment word reached the temple, along with Kit Fisto, Plo Koon, and a contingent of the 501st, under Anakin Skywalker's command, shuttled up through Coruscant's crowded traffic lanes toward the largest of the alien vessels, a saucer in-hull silhouette easily the size of a Venator, hanging silent and dark-lit against the stars. Anakin had said little since the briefing. Hugh's name meant nothing to him, but the description of 100,000 clones, without inhibitor chips, had lodged somewhere behind his ribs and stayed there, an itch he couldn't place and didn't like. He kept glancing at the clone troopers in his own shuttle, Rex, arms crossed, watching the approaching hull with the particular stillness of a soldier who suspected he was about to meet something that made him obsolete and finding himself unable to read what he felt. The airlock cycled without resistance. Someone, something, aboard had been expecting them. The interior lighting was cooler than Republic cruisers, blue-white instead of the warm amber the clones were built to feel comfortable under, and the corridors smelled faintly of ozone and recycled air, processed through systems no Coruscanti engineer had designed. Consoles glowed with unfamiliar interfaces, and at every junction, every station, every turn of the corridor, there were clones. Not clones as the Grand Army knew them. These were no standard-issue plastoid armor, no Phase 1 or Phase 2 plating stamped with unit markings and Legion colors. They wore close-fitting duty uniforms in muted grays and blacks, practical rather than martial, and they moved through the ship with an ease that had nothing of the barracks in it. No 45th inline deference. No reflexive snap to attention that every clone in the 501st had been drilled into since the day they could walk. One of them, stationed at what appeared to be a tactical console near the bridge threshold, looked up as Rex approached and simply nodded, the way one professional acknowledges another, not the way a trooper acknowledges rank. CT designation? Rex asked, falling back on the only framework he had. We don't use those, the clone said. His voice was unmistakably the same voice, Rex's voice. Anakin's, Cody's, the voice of every clone in the galaxy. Born from the same template, but something in the cadence was different. Unhurried, entirely his own. I go by and name myself Halcyon, actually. Most of us picked names in the first week. Seemed strange not to. Rex said nothing. Anakin watched his old friend's face carefully and saw something crack open there that he recognized, because he'd felt it himself more than once. The sight of a version of your own life that had been allowed to choose things you never had. You know what you are, Obi-Wan said, stepping forward, gentler than Rex, but no less direct. What you were grown from. We know everything, Halcyon said. Hugh made sure of that before he woke us. Every one of us aboard this fleet knows exactly what a chip does, what it was for, and that we don't carry one. We know what Order 66 is. His gaze moved, deliberately, to Rex, to the plastoid armor, to the shock of recognition passing openly across the Jedi's faces now that the phrase had been spoken aloud a second time in one day. We know it hasn't happened yet. Here, the word yet sat in the corridor like a held breath. Then you understand, Plo Koon said carefully, why we need to know your intentions. A fleet this size, crewed by soldiers we did not train, did not vet, and cannot verify. Our intentions, Halcyon said, without heat, are whatever your council decides they should be, within reason. We didn't choose to exist for a cause. Hugh gave us that much, at least. We weren't decanted into a war we didn't consent to. But we also weren't decanted for nothing. We know why we're here. We know what's coming for the order that made us. In whatever twisted version of us marches under your banners right now. If you want soldiers, we can be soldiers. If you want something else, we're listening. Anakin had been quiet the entire exchange, moving instead toward the tactical display at the console's edge, drawn the way he was always drawn toward machinery he didn't understand yet. His fingers hovered over an unfamiliar control surface, and Halcyon, watching him, made no move to stop him. This isn't Republic tech, Anakin said. It's not separatist either. It's not anything. He stopped, frowning at a readout that meant nothing to him, and somehow, simultaneously, everything. Warp drive. This says warp drive. Faster than light without a hyperspace lane, Halcyon confirmed. Won't do you much good in a galaxy that doesn't map to warp coordinates. Hugh, explain that part too. But the weapons will translate just fine. Phasers cut cleaner than your blasters. Photon torpedoes hit harder than anything on a Venator. And the shields, he tapped a console, and a status display bloomed to life, dense with numbers. Anakin didn't recognize, but instantly wanted to. The shields alone would have made the difference. At half a dozen battles you've already fought and barely won. Obi-Wan's eyes had not left Halcyon's face. You said you know what's coming. For the Order. I know Order 66 kills nearly everyone in it, Halcyon said. And for the first time something moved behind his composure. Not malice. Not satisfaction. Something closer to grief borrowed from a war he'd never fought. I know it's supposed to happen soon. I know your Chancellor gives the order. And every brother marching beside every one of you turns his weapon on the man he calls General, because a chip in his skull makes the choosing simple. He looked past Obi-Wan to Anakin and held the look a beat longer than comfort allowed. Hugh said there's more he needs the Council to hear before any of this makes sense. About the Chancellor. About the war. About you, specifically, General Skywalker. I'd suggest you don't wait long to hear it. The boarding parties returned to the temple with Halcyon in tow, an unprecedented breach of protocol that Mace Windu allowed only because Q had made it clear, in the particular tone of a being who found protocol tediously beside the point, that further delay would not be tolerated. The council reconvened in full, all 12 masters present. The chamber's usual dignified calm replaced by something taut and unfamiliar. Anakin stood at the room's edge rather than seated among the masters. Arms crossed, jaw set. Still turning Halcyon's words over like a stone, he couldn't stop touching. Hugh had not moved from his position, hovering cross-legged near the chamber's center. And if he'd noticed the hour that passed while the ships were inspected, he gave no sign of impatience. If anything, he seemed amused, watching the Jedi arrange themselves with the particular gravity of beings who sensed the ground shifting beneath. A temple that had stood, in one form or another, for 1,000 generations. Now, Hugh said, the chips. Properly. Because I suspect several of you are still hoping. There's a more palatable explanation waiting, somewhere in the details. And I'd rather disappoint you now than let you build a comfortable lie to stand on. We're listening, Windus said. Kamino, Hugh began. A world of storms and cloning vats. Contracted a decade before this. War to grow an army nobody in the Republic officially ordered, except, as you've already worked out, they were ordered by a dead man's name laundered through Tyrannus's convenience. The template, Jango Fett, bounty hunter, unmodified, chosen for skill rather than sentiment. Every clone in your grand army descends from that single genome, grown at accelerated rates, aged twice the normal pace, engineered for obedience from the vat up. He paused. And into every one of them, during gestation, on Kamino's own operating tables, a biochip was placed. Small, elegant, vile. For what stated purpose? Asked PLO Kuhn. Behavioral modulation, officially. Suppression of aggression past combat useful thresholds. A leash, dressed up as a kindness. We're protecting them from themselves. The Kaminoans would tell you. If you asked, and they believe it. Because they've never known a version of a clone that didn't need one. But that's not its true function. Its true function activates on a single verbal trigger, broadcast to every chip simultaneously. And it does not modulate anything. It overrides. Every clone, everywhere, ceases to be a soldier making a choice and becomes, for the span of the order's execution, a weapon with no will of his own. Loyalty doesn't factor into it. Friendship doesn't factor into it. A clone who has served beside a Jedi for 3 years, who trusts him, who would have died for him unprompted. The day before, that clone will put a bolt through his general's back without a flicker of hesitation. And afterward, if he survives long enough to reflect on it, will likely never fully understand why he did it. The chip doesn't leave room for understanding. That's rather the point. Mace Windu's stillness had become something almost physical, a held breath given a body. You said this is called Order 66. A designation buried in Republic military contingency protocols, filed away as one of several hundred numbered orders any clone commander might theoretically execute, all of them mundane, troop redeployments, supply reroutes, standard operational housekeeping. 66 is not mundane. 66 is Execute Order 66. All Jedi are now to be identified as enemies of the Republic and are to be terminated on sight. Hugh let the phrase land, exactly as written, without softening. Issued by the Supreme Commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, which is, currently, and rather conveniently, Chancellor Palpatine himself. Several masters had gone very still. Kit Fisto's jaw tightened. Somewhere near the back, a younger master. Hugh didn't bother learning her name. She wasn't relevant to the story he was telling, made a small, involuntary sound. He wrote himself the authority to order your extermination. Windu said slowly, using the army you yourselves lead into battle. He wrote himself the authority to order your extermination using an army he built specifically because you would trust it. Hugh corrected. That's the elegance of it. If elegance is the word for something this vicious, he didn't need to build a force capable of defeating the Jedi. Order in open combat, you'd have seen that coming. Prepared for it, perhaps even won. He needed a force the Jedi would never suspect. Would fight beside, would sleep unarmed next to, would call brother. Betrayal from within cuts far deeper than an army at the gates, and it leaves no one alive to organize a resistance. Because the blow lands everywhere, all at once. Before anyone even knows there's a war being fought against them specifically. Yoda had said nothing through the entire explanation, and when he finally spoke, His voice carried none of its usual measured cadence, only the flat, careful tone of a being holding something too large to process all at once. "How many?" he said. "Of the order." Would dot. Hugh's expression, for the first time since his arrival, lost every trace of theater. "Nearly all of you," he said quietly. "In the timeline I pulled that fleet out of, Order 66 was executed with near total success across every front of this war. Simultaneously, within hours, younglings in this temple were not spared. I want to be precise about that, because I think precision matters more than comfort right now. This was not a battle you lost. It was a slaughter you never saw coming, carried out by soldiers who loved you, using a switch none of you knew existed, flipped by a man you elected to protect you. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, that presses on the chest, that no words seem adequate to fill. Anakin, at the chamber's edge, had gone pale, one hand braced against the wall as though the floor had genuinely tilted beneath him. "Why?" Mace Windu said finally, very quietly. "Are you telling us this now? Before it happens? What do you want from us, Q?" Hugh's smile returned, but it was thinner now, and something underneath it looked almost tired. "That," he said, "is rather the interesting question, isn't it? But we're not quite finished with the why of Palpatine yet. There's more you need to understand about the shape of this war before you're ready to hear what I actually want. Sit with the chips a moment longer. Master Windu, the next part concerns a boy who trusts a Sith Lord he calls his friend. And I promise you, that part is going to hurt considerably more." Hugh let the silence stretch just long enough to make his point, then continued, and this time there was no theater in his delivery at all, only the flat cadence of a being reciting something he had watched too many times to soften. "You want a date," he said. "You'll get one, though it won't mean much to you yet, because it's tied to something none of you have any way of predicting. It happens near the war's end, near what you'll believe, right up until the final hour, is victory. The Separatist leadership, cornered, Dooku dead, the galaxy one signature away from peace. And in that exact moment, when the guard is down, when relief has made everyone careless, Palpatine gives the order, not to a battlefield, to every clone, on every world, simultaneously. Here, on Coruscant, in this temple, it does not spare the younglings." The words landed like a physical blow. Even Yoda's ears, which had drooped through the earlier revelations, went rigid. "Say that again," Mace Windu said, and his voice had changed, not louder, but lower, stripped of the council chamber's careful formality, something closer to the voice of a man, standing over a grave that hadn't been dug yet. "I won't soften it for repetition," Hugh said. "The temple falls in a single night. Clone troopers under a Jedi commander's own trust move through these halls and kill everyone in them, children included, because the chip does not discriminate by age, by rank, by how many times that youngling waved at a trooper in the corridor that morning. It is not combat. It is extermination, and it is carried out efficiently, because efficiency is what these soldiers were built for." Kit Fisto's hand had drifted, unconsciously, to his lightsaber hilt, not a threat, a grounding gesture, the reflex of a body that needed to hold on to something solid. Plo Koon had gone entirely still. Somewhere near the chamber's edge, a Padawan messenger who had slipped in unnoticed to deliver a data chip stood frozen in the doorway, having heard far more than she was meant to, her face draining of color. "You said nearly all," Yoda said. His voice, too, had lost its measured rhythm. "Who commands this? Who leads clones into a temple of children?" Hugh's gaze moved, deliberately, and did not land on any face already turned toward him. It landed, instead, on the one figure at the chamber's edge who had gone entirely silent. Entirely still, arms no longer crossed but hanging at his sides as though he already sensed, on some level beneath conscious thought, that the answer concerned him directly. "That," Hugh said quietly, "is part of the story I promised you would hurt more. I'm not ready to give it to you yet, and frankly, Skywalker isn't ready to hear it yet either, though he'll need to before this is finished. Let me give you the rest of the shape first. The names. Because a death toll is an abstraction, and I find abstractions let beings look away too easily." "Say them," Windu said. His composure, the thing Q suspected, the council relied on, nearly as much as they relied on Yoda's counsel. The immovable stillness that had made Mace Windu, the Order's blade for 2 decades, had a crack in it now, visible in the set of his jaw, the whiteness of his knuckles where his hand rested on his lightsaber. Kiadi Mundi, cut down on my Jito. Shot in the back by troopers he'd led for the entire war. Ayla Secura, on Felucia, same betrayal, same efficiency. Stas Ali, PLO Kun. Hugh glanced, almost apologetically, at the Keldor master standing not 3 feet from him. Alive, listening to his own death recited. As fact, shot from his own starfighter's cockpit by the pilot, who'd flown escort beside him 100 times. Ayla, Kiadi, Stas, PLO, I could continue. I could give you every name. Nearly 100,000 Jedi across the galaxy, reduced, within the same handful of hours, to a footnote in a speech Palpatine gives afterward, declaring the Jedi Order a traitorous cabal that attempted to seize control of the Republic, and that he, in his grief and his mercy, was forced to crush it to save you all. He blames us, PLO Kun said slowly, for our own murder. He rewrites it entirely, Hugh confirmed. The galaxy doesn't mourn the Jedi Order. The galaxy is told to fear it, retroactively, as though 2,000 years of peacekeeping had been a slow-building betrayal all along. And because the only witnesses capable of contradicting the story are dead, the story simply becomes true. That's the part one find most unforgivable. If you're curious whether I'm capable of the sentiment, not the deaths. Beings die. That's rather the nature of things, even in my line of work. It's the erasure afterward. The Order doesn't just fall. It's made into the villain of its own extinction. Mace Windu turned away from the chamber, toward the window, toward the ordinary golden light of Coruscant's afternoon falling, across spires that, in another version of this exact day, would already be burning. His shoulders were rigid, his breathing controlled through what Q recognized, with something that might have been respect, as sheer force of will. You said nearly all, Windu said again, without turning around. Who survives? A handful, Q said. Scattered, hunted for decades after. Most of them dying alone, in hiding, never knowing there were others. Obi-Wan Kenobi survives. Yoda survives. And 2 children are born on the same night the temple falls. Hidden so completely that not even the Sith who fathers. Hugh stopped himself, deliberately, watching the word land, half-spoken and letting the council sit with the shape of what he hadn't yet said. There's more to that thread. I'll come back to it. For now, I want you to understand this clearly, because I suspect some part of you is already reaching for the comfortable version, where this is prevented simply by knowing about it. It isn't that simple. The chips are already in every clone in your army. Right now, today, while we speak, the order hasn't been given, but the trigger exists in every soldier fighting beside you. And Palpatine hasn't needed it yet because the war isn't finished yet. That is the true horror of what I'm showing you. Master Windu, not a tragedy that already happened, a blade already resting against your throat, waiting only for its owner's convenience. The Padawan messenger in the doorway had not moved, and no one had yet thought to send her away. A small mercy or a small cruelty. Hugh couldn't quite decide which. Letting a child hear the shape of her order's death before the day it might arrive. Mace Windu noticed her at last, gestured her out with a single sharp motion, and waited until the door had sealed before he turned back to Q. His composure rebuilt into something harder, more purposeful. The look of a man who had decided grief was a luxury for later. You said this began before the war, Windu said. Before the Trade Federation blockaded Naboo. Before any of us suspected a Sith Lord still existed in the galaxy at all. Longer than that, Q said. But Naboo is a reasonable place to start, since it's where your own suspicions should have started and didn't. A decade ago, the Trade Federation blockades a peaceful world over a trade dispute, so thin it barely survives scrutiny. A 14-year-old queen resists. A Jedi master and his apprentice are sent to negotiate, and negotiation fails. Because it was never meant to succeed, Sidious needed a crisis. Needed the Senate destabilized. Needed a sympathetic young queen desperate. Enough to call for a vote of no confidence against a chancellor he'd already arranged to have replaced by himself. Palpatine was a senator from Naboo, said Kit Fisto slowly, working the thread forward. He rose to chancellor in the aftermath of that crisis. On a platform of decisive leadership. promising an end to the corruption and paralysis that let the invasion happen. Q said, corruption and paralysis he had spent years quietly cultivating in the Senate. Specifically, so his own ascension would look like relief rather than seizure. Every crisis since has followed the same architecture. He creates the fire. He arrives, reluctantly, humbly, to put it out. And each time, the Senate hands him a little more power he insists he doesn't want. And he accepts it anyway, for the good of the Republic. And Naboo's queen, Windu said, Padme Amidala. Hugh's expression flickered, the first genuine hesitation. He'd shown all day, and he chose, deliberately, to set that threat aside rather than pull it yet. There's more to her than her politics. I'll return to it. Let me finish the architecture first, because I think you need the whole shape before the details mean anything. He continued without waiting for confirmation. Dooku left this order convinced its dogma had calcified past the point of usefulness, not entirely. Without cause, Master Yoda. Though you already know that. Given how many nights you've spent turning his departure over without resolution. Sidious found him already disillusioned and simply gave that disillusionment a direction. Count Dooku became Darth Tyrannus, took control of a growing separatist movement built on legitimate grievances about Republic corruption, and turned it into a private army funded, armed, and directed by corporate interests, the Trade Federation, the banking clan, the Techno Union, all of whom believed they were investing in their own profit and were, in fact, simply financing Sidious's war on both sides simultaneously. Both sides, PLO Kuhn repeated. You keep returning to that phrase. Because it's the entire mechanism, Hugh said. The Republic funds the clone army. The Separatists fund the droid army. Both armies exist because of decisions Sidious personally orchestrated, under two different names, wearing two different faces, and neither side has the faintest idea the war they're fighting was manufactured by the same architect on both ends of the table. Every battle, every world lost and retaken, every clone and every droid destroyed, all of it serves exactly one purpose: grinding this war on long enough, bloody enough, exhausting enough, that when Sidious finally moves to seize total power, the galaxy won't resist. It will beg him to save it. Yoda's eyes had opened again, sharp now, cutting through the numbness that had settled over him during the temple's fall. Grievous, he said. The droid armies. Explain their place in this. General Grievous is a cyborg warlord. Useful, terrifying, entirely expendable, Hugh said. A face for the separatist military that lets Dooku remain in shadow and lets Sidious remain invisible entirely. Grievous believes he's fighting a war of conviction against Jedi oppression. He is, in fact, a puppet 3 layers removed from the hand that's actually pulling him, kept alive precisely as long as he remains useful and discarded the moment he isn't. And Maul, Windu said. Darth Maul faced Qui-Gon Jinn on Naboo a decade ago. Killed by Kenobi. That thread, at least, is closed. Is it? Hugh said, and something almost like dark amusement returned to his voice. Maul survives that duel, Master Windu. Cut in half. Yes, a detail I'll spare you the mechanics of, but survives. Driven mad by rage and pain for years in the depths of a junk world, before clawing his way back into relevance with cybernetic legs and an appetite for vengeance against everyone who wronged him, Sidious very much included. He resurfaces during this war more than once. An unpredictable variable even his former master doesn't fully control anymore. He is not your enemy in the way Sidious is. He is something closer to a wound that never closed, lashing out at whoever comes near it. The room absorbed this in silence. Another certainty, another closed chapter, reopened and made uncertain again in the space of a single sentence. So the entire war, Mace Windu said finally, each word deliberate, testing the shape of the conclusion before he committed to it aloud. The Separatist crisis. The vote that handed Palpatine emergency powers, the clone army we lead, the droid army we fight, every death on every front, is a single Sith Lord's construction, designed from the outset to end with him ruling absolute, and the Jedi Order exterminated by the very soldiers we trained to protect the Republic he intends to become emperor of. Yes, Hugh said simply. There was no theater left in the word at all. You've had the pieces in front of you for years. Master Windu, Sifo-Dyas's death, Dooku's departure. Hey, Chancellor who somehow always benefits from every crisis that threatens to unseat him. You didn't fail to notice because you're foolish. You failed to notice because you weren't. Looking for betrayal from inside your own house. And Sidious built his entire plan on the assumption that you never would. Now, he glanced toward Anakin, still silent, still pale. At the chamber's edge, we come to the part where this stops being architecture and starts being personal. Are you ready for that, Master Windu? Because I don't think you are. But I don't think waiting will make it easier. Anakin had not spoken since the chamber's earlier revelations. But when Q's gaze settled on him fully for the first time, something in his stance changed, not quite defensive, not quite defiant, the particular stillness of a man who has spent years perfecting the art of looking calm while something inside him screams. You've been very quiet, Skywalker, Q said. I find that interesting, given how loud you usually are. Say what you're going to say, Anakin replied. His voice was tight, controlled in the way that meant it was costing him something to keep it that way. Q inclined his head, almost respectful. Padme Amidala, he said. Former Queen of Naboo, current senator. You've known her since you were 9 years old. A slave boy on Tatooine who told her, quite earnestly, that he was going to marry her one day. You did, in fact, marry her. Secretly. On Naboo. A little under a year ago. The silence that followed was total. Every master in the chamber turned toward Anakin. And Anakin did not deny it, did not move at all. His face gone the particular white of a man, watching the floor open beneath him in front of everyone whose respect he'd spent a decade earning. That is forbidden, Mace Windu said. And the words carried no cruelty. Only the flat weight of a rule spoken so many times it had become reflex. I'm aware it's forbidden, Q said, before Anakin could answer. Before the chamber could tip into a reckoning Q had not yet finished setting up. That's rather the point I intend to make. And I'd ask you to hold your judgment a moment longer, Master Windu. Because I promise the forbidding of it is not the neutral, wise policy your order believes it to be. But first, the rest of the shape. Because Anakin deserves to hear it whole rather than in fragments designed to wound. He continued, and his voice, for the first time, had lost nearly all of its performance, settling into something almost gentle. You have a Padawan, Q said, named Ahsoka Tano. You love her the way you'd love a sister. Though your order has no word for that either. In the timeline I've shown you, she is falsely accused of a crime she did not commit, hunted by her own order with barely a trial. And though the truth eventually surfaces and she's exonerated, the experience breaks something. In her trust of this institution that never fully mends, she leaves the order before Order 66 ever comes. That choice, born from your failure to protect her when it mattered, is the reason she survives what the rest of you do not. Anakin's jaw tightened, his eyes bright with something he was visibly fighting not to let fall. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Q continued, your master, your closest friend, the closest thing to a father this order allowed you to have. He survives the temple's fall, hides for nearly 2 decades on a desert world not far from the one you grew up on, watching over a child he's sworn to protect, before dying, eventually, by his own choice. In a duel against the man his apprentice becomes. Anakin repeated, barely audible. I'm not finished, Q said, not unkindly, though there was no way to make what came next kind. Padme Amidala dies the same night the temple falls. Childbirth, complications the healers cannot fully explain, though I'd suggest to you that a broken heart is more literal a diagnosis than your medicine tends to credit. She dies believing the man she loved was lost to her entirely. She names her children before she goes. Twins. A boy, Luke. A girl, Leia. They're separated at birth, hidden on opposite ends of the galaxy, raised never knowing each other exists, never knowing their mother's name, never knowing their father survived the war that killed her. Anakin made a sound that wasn't quite a word. One hand braced against the chamber wall now, the picture of a man whose legs had nearly stopped holding him. Their father, Yoda said quietly, though it was less a question than a confirmation he already dreaded. Their father, Hugh said, and turned back to Anakin directly, is the man who leads the assault on this temple. The man who kills the younglings hiding in this very building. The man Sidious spends this entire war cultivating, isolating, lying to, manipulating through fear of loss until fear becomes the only language left in him. You become Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker, not because you are weak, not because you are wicked, because every single person in this room, every rule this order enforces, every wall it built between you and the people you loved, left you with nowhere to take your fear except toward the one man patient enough to offer you an answer, however poisoned it was. Enough, Mace Windu said, sharp, stepping between Hugh and the visibly shaking younger Jedi. This serves no purpose but cruelty. It serves the exact purpose I came here to serve, Hugh said, and for the first time his voice rose. Not to a shout, but to something with real force behind it. The sound of a being who had watched this exact tragedy unfold enough times across, enough iterations of enough galaxies, that his patience for polite half-truths had entirely run out. You asked me why I brought a fleet. Master Windu. I brought it because a war is coming. That will end with this order's extinction. And this young man's soul hollowed out and worn as a mask by the very evil you're all currently failing to see standing in your own Senate rotunda. I am telling you every name that matters because abstractions let you look away, and I will not let you look away. Kagan. Jin died on Naboo, believing he saw something in this boy worth training against this Council's own reluctance, and he was right. And none of you have ever fully honored what he saw, because you were too busy being frightened of what loving someone might cost him. He turned, finally, back to Yoda, and something in his expression had softened into something almost pleading. Duchess Satine of Mandalore, he said, quieter now. Obi-Wan loves her too, and denies it his entire life. And she dies in his arms regardless. Killed by Maul specifically because Sidious understands, better than any of you, that love left unspoken and unprotected becomes a wound your enemies can reach into whenever they please. That is the thread running under everything I've told you today. Not a prophecy, a pattern. Your order keeps insisting attachment is the danger. I would ask you, before this day is finished, to consider the possibility that the danger was never the attachment at all. It was leaving it unguarded, unspoken, and alone. No one spoke for a long moment. Anakin had turned away from the room entirely, facing the window, shoulders rigid. One hand pressed briefly against his eyes before dropping back to his side. The posture of a man refusing, by sheer will, to weep in front of the council that had just watched his entire secret life laid bare. Yoda's hover chair had drifted lower still, and for the first time in living memory, several masters present would later say, he looked genuinely old. You've made your accusation, Mace Windu said finally. His voice had none of its earlier sharpness left, only a kind of exhausted care. The sound of a man trying to hold a structure together that he could feel, cracking under his own hands. Say it plainly, Hugh. Don't dress it in parables. Plainly, then, Hugh said. Your code teaches that attachment leads to fear, fear leads to suffering, and suffering leads to the dark side. It's not wrong. Exactly. That chain of causality is real. I've watched it play out in 1,000 forms across 1,000 civilizations. But your order took a true observation and built the wrong solution out of it. You didn't teach your members to love wisely, to hold what matters without being consumed by the fear of losing it. You taught them not to love at all. And when a boy who lost his mother to slavers, who watched her die in his arms after failing to save her in time, who has spent his entire life terrified of losing the people he cares about, when that boy falls in love anyway, because he is human and love does not consult permission slips from a council, you didn't offer him a framework for carrying that fear honestly. You offered him secrecy, shame, a lie he had to maintain from every person he trusted, including the 2 men in this room who might have actually helped him carry it, had they been allowed to know. The code exists for reasons refined over 1,000 generations, said a master near the chamber's edge, quiet but firm. Attachment clouds judgment. A Jedi who fears losing someone becomes vulnerable to exactly the manipulation you've described. A Jedi who is forbidden from ever discussing that fear becomes considerably more vulnerable, Hugh said, turning toward her without malice, but without softening either. You've built an order of beings capable of extraordinary compassion for strangers across the galaxy, and denied them the right to name the person they love most in the world without risking expulsion. Do you understand what you've actually created? Not detachment. Not peace. Isolation. Every Jedi who falls in love does so in secret. Alone, with no mentor to turn to. No elder who's walked that path and can say, honestly, here is how you hold this without it breaking you. You've made love into something shameful instead of something disciplined. And shame, I promise you, is far more dangerous to the soul than honest attachment ever was. Yoda's eyes had opened again, and there was something raw in them now. The look of a being turning over 800 years of teaching and finding. For the first time, a crack he could not immediately dismiss. Attachment to outcome, Yoda said slowly, working through it aloud. Clouded judgment does, in younglings I have seen. Fear of loss, the path to darkness it can be. It can be, Q agreed. It is not inevitably. There's a considerable difference between those two words. Master Yoda, and your code has spent 1,000 years, collapsing them into the same warning. Padme Amidala did not corrupt Anakin Skywalker by loving him. Their marriage did not doom this galaxy. What doomed it was that he could tell no one, seek no counsel, receive no guidance on how to be both a husband and a Jedi. Because your order had decided, dogmatically, that the two were mutually exclusive before it had ever actually tested whether that was true. So when his fear became unbearable, when he began dreaming, correctly, that she would die in childbirth, he had exactly one place left to turn. A kind old man in the Chancellor's office who had spent 3 years quietly positioning himself as the only adult in young Skywalker's life who never judged him, never scolded him, only listened, and offered comfort, and waited. Sidious didn't create Anakin's fear of loss. He simply made himself the only person patient enough to catch it when your order made itself unavailable. Anakin turned back from the window at last, his eyes red-rimmed, but his voice, when it came, steady. He told me there was a way to save her. He said quietly, not quite to the council, more to the room itself, as though speaking the thought aloud for the first time, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. That the Sith knew secrets about cheating death. I didn't believe him, not really. But I kept listening, because he was the only one who'd let me say her name out loud without flinching. The admission landed harder than anything Q had said all day, precisely because it came from Anakin himself, unprompted. The sound of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried alone for years. There it is, Q said quietly, and for once there was no theater in it at all, only something that might have been sorrow. That's the wound, Master Windu. Not the marriage, the silence around it. A boy who needed exactly one adult in this temple to say your fear is understandable. Let's carry it together. And instead found that adult waiting in the Senate rotunda instead of the council chamber, because the council chamber had made itself the one place in the galaxy where that fear could never be spoken. Windu was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from Anakin to Yoda to the window and the golden light beyond it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the certainty it had held that morning. If what you say is true, he said slowly, then this order's fall was never only Sidious's doing. No, Hugh said. It never is, in these stories. The villain builds the trap, but the walls that make the trap inescapable, those, I'm afraid, you built yourselves. One well-intentioned rule at a time. The chamber held its silence for a long time after that, and Q, for once, did not fill it. He seemed to understand, or perhaps simply chose, out of whatever passed for mercy in a being like him, that some pauses needed to be endured rather than narrated. It was Yoda who finally broke it, and when he spoke, his voice had none of the ancient, unhurried cadence the council was accustomed to. It was the voice of someone very old and, for the first time in a very long while, very afraid. A crime not yet committed, you have shown us, Yoda said. A war engineered by a man we call friend. A boy failed by rules we called wisdom. Tell us then, Hugh, what you would have us do. Simply arrest the Chancellor and be done with it, do you suggest? A trial, on the word of a being none of us can sense in the Force. No evidence but your voice in a fleet that fell from nowhere. I'm not going to tell you what to do, Hugh said. And something in his tone had changed, less performance now, closer to the truth of why he'd come at all. That's rather the point I've been circling this entire conversation, Master Yoda. And I suspect you already knew it, and were hoping I'd spare you the responsibility. I am not here to fix your galaxy for you. I could if I wished. I could unmake Palpatine between one breath and the next, erase every chip from every clone skull with a thought, and be done with the entire tragedy before dinner. I find that I don't wish to. Not because I lack the compassion, though I understand why beings assume that of me, but because a galaxy saved by a god learns nothing except that gods exist to save it. I'd rather leave you capable of saving yourselves. That's the gift, Master Yoda, not the fleet. The fleet is just tools. The gift is knowing before it happens instead of after. And what you build from that knowing is entirely, terrifyingly, yours. You ask us to act against a crime not committed, Windu said. Our own laws, our own philosophy, counsels against exactly that. A Jedi does not strike from fear or from prophecy. We act on what is, not on what might be. And yet you fight an entire war, Q said, on the strength of a separatist threat that is, itself, a manufactured prophecy Sidious wrote for you to fear. You've been acting on his authored version of what might be for 3 years. Master Windu, I'm simply offering you a truer one. Windu had no immediate answer for that, and something in his stillness suggested the blow had landed exactly where Q intended. What I can tell you, Q continued, quieter now, is what happens if you do nothing. If you thank me politely for the fleet, catalog it as a curiosity, and return to fighting this war exactly as Sidious has scripted it, the chips remain. The order comes, on schedule, dressed as victory. This temple burns regardless of anything you've learned here today, because knowledge and use changes nothing at all. That is not a threat, Master Yoda. It's simply the shape of consequence. And I find beings deserve to see it clearly before they choose to ignore it. Yoda was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant, and when he finally looked up, something had settled in his expression, not certainty, not yet, but the particular resolve of a being who has stopped looking for an exit from a decision and begun, instead, to actually make it. Different, this choice must be, Yoda said slowly, from the fear that leads to darkness. Acting from knowledge, not from terror, we must. Careful, we must be, that in preventing one horror, another we do not become. That, Q said, and for the first time all day, something like genuine approval crossed his face, is the wisest sentence anyone in this room has spoken since I arrived. Hold on to it. You'll need it, because the next decisions are not going to be comfortable ones. 100,000 Jedi live or die on how carefully you move from here. And Sidious does not yet know his hand has been shown. That is the only advantage you currently hold. I'd encourage you not to waste it debating philosophy for the next 6 months. Windu straightened, something resolving in his own posture as well. The particular clarity of a soldier who has finished grieving long enough to start planning. The chips, he said. Can they be removed? Deactivated? Yes, Hugh said. Not easily, and not by me. I've given you information, not solutions, and I intend to keep it that way. But your medical corps, working from what I've shown you, can develop the means. Quietly, beginning with the clones closest to your most trusted commanders, before word of any of this reaches Coruscant's more compromised corners. And Palpatine, Anakin said, his voice rough but steady, stepping fully back into the conversation. For the first time, since his own confession, we can't simply confront him. Not yet. Not without proof he can't spin into another lie for the Holonets. No, Hugh agreed. You cannot. Which means the next months will require the one thing this council has always claimed to value above all else and rarely practiced under real pressure. Patience, paired with courage, in equal and uncomfortable measure. I'd suggest you begin with the fleet I've given you. 111 ships and 100,000 soldiers loyal to no chip and no hidden order. That is not nothing, Master Windu. That is, if you're clever about it. The first advantage Sidious has not accounted for in a plan he believes flawless. Yoda's gaze lifted, meeting Q's directly. And for the first time, there was something almost like gratitude in it. Hard-won and heavily qualified. A gift, you called this. A burden, it also is. Most true gifts are, Q said. I've found the two rarely arrive separately. What you build from it, Master Yoda, that part isn't mine to give you at all. By the time the sun set over Coruscant spires, the council had made no grand pronouncement, called no press conference, issued no dramatic ultimatum to the Senate. Q had insisted on. Exactly that kind of restraint, before he'd allowed himself to be satisfied. And Windu, however reluctantly, had come to agree. A war fought against an enemy who did not yet know he'd been seen required. Patience first. Spectacle never. What they had decided, in the hours since Q's arrival, was smaller and larger than a declaration. The fleet would remain in high orbit. Its presence explained to the wider Republic as an experimental allied contingent from beyond the Outer Rim, true enough, in its way, to survive scrutiny. Halcyon and his brothers would begin, quietly, training alongside vetted Jedi commanders. Their numbers a secret held tightly within the Council and a small circle of trusted senators, Padme Amidala among them, finally told the truth by a husband no longer willing to carry it alone. Master Vocarache, informed only of the chip's existence and given no explanation of its source, would begin discreetly the long work of understanding what could be safely removed and from whom, starting with the men closest to the officers least likely to ask questions. Sidious might overhear. Anakin Skywalker did not receive absolution that day. The Council did not restore some easy comfort to a young man whose secrets had been dragged into the light in front of everyone whose respect he'd spent a decade earning. But something had shifted regardless, not forgiveness exactly. Something closer to acknowledgement. Obi-Wan found him afterward on a temple balcony overlooking the sunset traffic lanes, and rather than a lecture, offered only a hand on his shoulder and a quiet admission of his own, that he, too, had loved someone he'd never been permitted to name, and had spent years wondering what that silence had cost them both. Yoda spent that night alone in meditation longer than he had in decades, turning Q's words over the way a stonecutter turns a flawed gem, searching for the one clean line that might, eventually, let something whole be cut from it. He did not resolve the question of attachment before dawn. He suspected, with something like relief, that he was not meant to resolve it alone, or quickly, or ever entirely. Q did not linger for gratitude. He vanished as he'd arrived, mid-sentence, mid-thought. A god's idle errand concluded, leaving behind a fleet, a truth too large to unknow, and a council that would spend the coming months learning, carefully, deliberately, how to be worthy of both. Somewhere above Coruscant, 111 ships waited in silence, crewed by soldiers who had never been given a leash. And for the first time since the war began, the Jedi Order knew the shape of the blade resting at its throat, and had, at last, the chance to move first. May the Force be with you.